Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade American history class. This is the third in section that deals with the causes of the American Revolutionary War. We've been looking at the last two previous lectures at kind of the buildup of tensions between the American colonists and the British government, the king and parliament, as these tensions have been kind of rising. We left off last time with the Boston Tea Party, this celebration, not really, it's a frustration because the tea monopoly with the Tea Act. So they ditched the tea overboard and destroyed thousands and thousands of pounds of tea. British Parliament and the King are furious. They're outraged. How dare you? And so they punish the colonists, passing the coercive acts, which the colonists call the Intolerable Acts because they're so punishing. So this will be the third and final series of our lecture looking at kind of what was the final tipping point that will lead us to the point of no return where America will feel it has no choice but to push for independence. So, textbook readings, again, we're in Chapter 3, Section 5 of our United States History textbook, and starting in Chapter 4, Section 1, the Revolution begins. Our guiding questions today are, what was the purpose of the First Continental Congress? We kind of touched base on that in the last lecture. Who were the Minutemen? What happened at the Battle of Lexington and Concord? What was the purpose of the Second Continental Congress? What did they initially do to handle the growing crisis? What happened at the Battle of Bunker Hill? What was the Olive Branch Petition? And then who wrote Common Sense, and what was its message to the colonists? So that's going to be kind of our guiding question today. So here we go. Let's find out more about what happened. As we learned last lecture, at the end of the last lecture, that with the passage of the Intolerable Acts, the stripping away of the meeting of the assemblies, where citizens of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts could not meet and discuss and pass laws, the increasement of British soldiers being pushed into Massachusetts and patrolling the streets and basically putting things under martial law, the colonies decide, hey, if they can do this to our sister colony of Massachusetts, they could do the same thing to us. And so there's a little bit of some concern. So the colonists decide to organize and get together in Philadelphia in the summer and fall of 1774, so September, and 50 leaders from 12 colonies. Georgia, the farthest southern colony, doesn't send any delegates. They all agree that the colonists need to be united, that join or die, as we talked about in that last lecture. And so they decided to kind of unite and send a message to the king, kind of listing about the concerns. Say, hey, king, hey, we're your subject. We still believe in you, but we need you to help us out with what's going on with the parliament and some of these laws that are being passed. They also agree to boycott British goods until the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. Remember, to boycott means to refuse to buy or purchase. This worked so good with the last passage of the laws, like the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts, that they were getting pretty good at boycotting and organizing, so they thought they'd try it again. And then last but not least, they say if the boycotts don't work and things don't improve, we'll meet the following May of 1775 and we'll see what we need to do next. So that's kind of where they leave things off in Philadelphia in September of 1774, and that's the First Continental Congress. Minutemen. These become kind of like the colonists, the average people kind of begin to arm themselves. And the practice of a militia was not a new concept. In fact, really, ever since the founding of the colonies, there was a need to defend the colonies and these towns and settlements from attacks by the French or the Native Americans. And so think of the Minutemen as kind of like our National Guard. They're like volunteer soldiers. They have other jobs. They're smiths. They work in a smith. They're printers, they work in a printing press, they're farmers, they're merchants. But they all agree that if they need to be called upon to defend their town, they will call and serve. And the idea is that they could be ready at a minute's notice. And that's where the term Minutemen comes from. And so, especially in New England, especially in Massachusetts and the areas surrounding Boston, as things are kind of put under martial law, the colonists decide that these militias need to start kind of preparing, stockpiling weapons and gunpowder and ammunition, and be prepared for a possible conflict. And that, my friends, is what happens, is this conflict. It's bubbling up, especially in Massachusetts. There is a rumor that these Minutemen have a stockpile of weapons out in western Massachusetts, especially in Concord. And so the British general decides he's going to send his army to go get these weapons and these stockpile of gunpowder. And so he decides to sneak out of Boston and to go take these militia weapons at Concord. Now, the Sons of Liberty have been spying on this, and they decide that, hey, they're going to try to warn these citizens at Concord that the British are coming, right? That they're going to be coming here to take these weapons. And so they utilize these writers like Prescott, and probably most famously from the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem of Paul Revere. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. And they send word out. And Revere actually gets captured. Prescott makes it all the way through, and they decide to warn, saying that the redcoats are coming. Now, one common misconception is that they shout, hey, the British are coming, the British are coming. They all saw themselves as British citizens, so they wouldn't have said that. But they would have said the redcoats are coming, the soldiers, the regulars are coming, and so they prepared themselves. The first town, though, the soldiers had to pass through, though, to get really into, before they got to Concord, was Lexington. And this is where the very first shots fired of the American Revolutionary War take place. So the Battle of Lexington and Concord are two separate battles. They happen really on the same day. Lexington happens first, followed by the battle at Concord. And this is between the British soldiers and these Massachusetts Minutemen, these militia, these volunteer soldiers. And there is a open green space in Lexington where these British soldiers are kind of amassing, and then you have these militia citizens, colonists that are there as well to defend their town. The general, the army, the British soldiers say men disperse. As historians, we don't really know who shot first. It's one of the great mysteries of the Revolutionary War. But regardless, a shot is fired. The soldiers fire into the militia, the Minutemen, the militia fire back into the soldiers, and we have a first battle of the Revolutionary War. Now, the militia were no match for this particular battle against the regulars, and so they quickly disperse, and the regulars, the British soldiers, will eventually march on to Concord, where the weapons had already been moved, the gunpowder had already been moved, but the militia now are more organized as more and more militia are coming into from the surrounding towns, and they harass and kill and basically attack these British soldiers and drive them all the way back into Boston. So why is this battle really important? It really demonstrates that tensions have really increased, that they're willing to fight and die for what they see are their rights and their protections of their towns and their communities by what they perceive as abuses by the British government and by the arm of the British government, which is this military force that's been kind of occupying Massachusetts. So these are seen as sometimes as the first fired shots of the American Revolutionary War. Sometimes it's known as the shot heard around the world because it's going to trigger basically the revolution. But we're not there yet, but it's going to lead to some important future events here. Now remember, we left off with the First Continental Congress of this. We're going to meet back in May and see, if we need to solve any problems. And of course, you just had this major uprising battle taking place in Massachusetts. And there's actually now skirmishes and fighting taking place even after Lexington and Concord. So the crisis is just escalating in Massachusetts. So the delegates quickly arrive back in Philadelphia, and now all the delegates will be from all the 13 colonies, and they meet in May, and they basically say, we've got to take a hold of the situation. They decide that they're going to take these militia and reorganize them as a continental or colonial army, and they put this under the command of General George Washington. And he had military experience, served in the French and Indian War, and John Adams, a kind of a very smart, savvy politician from Massachusetts, realized, hey, we're going to have to get these southern colonies on board with us too. And so he kind of floats that name of George Washington, and he's quickly accepted. And he leaves the convention, he leaves Congress, and he goes and takes command of the militia units outside of Boston because things are getting really, really chaotic. There's another battle that will take place in June of 1775 called the Battle of Bunker Hill, also known as Breed's Hill. And this will take place again between these British soldiers and the Boston militia. George Washington hasn't showed up yet, so these are still militia units. This takes place on June 16th, 1775. Again, you have the British Army up against the militia units. The American colonials, they were able to take the hill on Bunker Hill, or Breed Hill was actually the name of the hill, and they were able to hold their ground and were able to drive the British back. 1,000 British soldiers were killed in action, KIA, and only 500 Americans were basically received casualties. Eventually they run out of ammunition and they had to leave the hill. And so the British technically win because they seize the property, or they seize the hill territory, but they do so at a pretty heavy toll, at a heavy cost. So Americans lose because they run out of bullets, but they show their tenacity, their ferociousness. They're going to defend their rights. So things are really beginning to escalate there in the New England colonies in Massachusetts. The Second Continental Congress decides to send out what's called the Olive Branch Petition in July of 1775. This is kind of the last-ditch effort. A petition is kind of like a letter, a protest saying, hey, we need your help. So they send a letter saying, hey, we got to calm this down. There needs to be some things you need to do to kind of on your end as the King of England, the King of Great Britain, to settle this problem, this issue. And so the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress sends this petition, and the king receives it because it takes many months to get there. And he says, bring the traitors to justice. He doesn't want to negotiate. This is an insurrection, a rebellion in the eyes of the British government, and so they're planning on sending more forces and more troops to squash the rebellion. Then a book is printed by Thomas Paine in January of 1776 called Common Sense, and it becomes a very quick bestseller around the colonies that makes the case why America would be better being its own country instead of being part of the British Empire. And it becomes a very quickly best-selling book. It's distributed up and down the colonies and tries to convince the colonists that, hey, let's join this cause for maybe independence. So this is where we start seeing kind of a shift in the thinking of many of the American colonists of trying to fix the relationship with Great Britain to now thinking more along the lines of being a patriot. Total breakaway, total independence. And again, there are about a third of the colonists that become patriots, about a third who became strongly loyal as loyalists, and then about a third that kind of are in that neutral boundary that they're not quite sure where they want to kind of put their allegiance to because they're not sure what's the best course of action. So as you can see here, things are now completely escalating. The only thing that we're waiting for is a formal declaration of our independence, and that's what we'll talk about next time. Thanks for listening. Again, if you have questions, please make sure you come talk to your teacher, and thanks for listening.